Hey guys, tonight we drift north, far north, where the land stretches thin and pale beneath a sky that never quite decides whether it wants to be day or night. You stand on a rocky shoreline dusted with frost, the air sharp enough to wake you, but somehow gentle at the same time, like a cold hand placed politely on your shoulder. The sea is dark and slow, breathing in and out, and beside you, a Viking longboat hesitates. That alone should tell you something is different here. These are people who normally row toward danger with a grin, and yet tonight, they pause.
You can almost hear them thinking, you probably won't survive this, not because of swords or axes, but because of who lives beyond the tree line. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And if you're listening from somewhere cozy or sleepless, feel free to drop your location and local time in the comments. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together.
You breathe in the smell of salt and cold pine as the boat nudges the shore, and then, almost apologetically, pulls back again. This is not a raid. This is hesitation. The Vikings, those famously fearless raiders, are edging along the northern fringe of their known world, and the further north they go, the quieter they become. Shields are still there, axes still sharp, but the jokes stop. Even the toughest among them glance inland with a kind of wary respect. You are now in Sámi territory, though the Vikings don't call it that. In their sagas, they use words like Finn or Scralling, vague labels for people who live beyond farms and kings, beyond maps that make sense. A mainstream historical fact quietly hums beneath the scene. Norse sources from the Viking Age consistently describe the Sámi as powerful magic users, people who could influence weather, luck, and fate itself. This isn't modern fantasy. It's written right into the sagas the Vikings told about themselves. The night deepens. Or maybe it doesn't. Up here, time behaves oddly. The sky glows faintly, like a bruise that refuses to darken. You realize something else that unsettles the Vikings. There are no obvious targets. No villages hugging the shore, no granaries, no churches full of silver, mostly because churches haven't arrived yet. The Sámi move with the seasons, following reindeer herds across tundra and forest. You can't burn what isn't there. That alone makes raiding awkward, like showing up to a party after everyone has already gone home. A light joke drifts in as you imagine a frustrated Viking checking his mental to-do list. Raid, loot, brag, only to find "get lost in endless snow" scribbled at the bottom. Not exactly a career highlight. You step inland, boots crunching softly. The ground is uneven, threaded with roots and patches of ice. Somewhere far off, a drumbeat echoes. Not loud, not threatening, just present. Historians still argue whether these sounds were real encounters or later Norse embellishments layered onto memory. But to you, standing here in the half-light, the effect is the same. It raises the hair on your arms. The Vikings believe the Sámi can sell favorable winds. This is the quirky tidbit that often surprises modern listeners. Norse sailors thought Sámi shamans could tie wind into knots on a rope, loosening one knot for a breeze and another for a storm. Imagine being a professional seafarer and genuinely worrying that the weather is being micromanaged by someone with better rope skills than you. It's both charming and deeply unsettling. You glance back toward the sea. The longboat rocks gently, as if reconsidering its life choices. The cold presses in, not violently, just steadily, reminding you that survival here depends less on bravery and more on knowing where to step, when to move, and when to wait. The Sámi know this land in a way outsiders never quite manage. The Vikings know it too, and that knowledge of their own disadvantage settles heavily. There is another quiet fact layered into this moment. Archaeological evidence shows very few signs of large-scale Viking violence in Sámi regions. Unlike England, Ireland, or parts of Francia, The far north lacks burned settlements and mass graves tied to Norse raids. Fear, belief, and environment combine into a kind of invisible shield. You don't need walls when your reputation does the work for you. A second light joke slips in as you imagine a Viking trying to threaten the tundra itself. "We'll be back in spring," he mutters, only to realize spring here is more of a suggestion than a promise. The wind picks up, threading through the trees with a whispering sound. The Vikings mutter about Seiðr, a form of magic associated with prophecy and altered states. Mainstream history tells us that even Norse gods practiced Seiðr, yet it was considered dangerous, unmanly, and deeply unsettling. You sense eyes on you, though you see no one. This is where sagas blur into storytelling. Historians still argue whether the Sámi intentionally cultivated an aura of fear, or whether Norse writers exaggerated cultural differences into something supernatural. Either way, the effect is real. The Vikings slow, then stop. They don't draw weapons. They listen. Time stretches. Your breath fogs the air. The drumbeat fades. Or maybe it was never there at all. A third gentle joke flickers through your mind. If intimidation were an Olympic sport, the Sámi would medal without even showing up. Eventually, the longboat pushes off again. No raid, no glory. Just a quiet retreat under a pale sky. This is how the story begins. Not with clashing steel, but with restraint. You turn back toward the shore, feeling the weight of snow, silence, and centuries of whispered fear settle around you. And as the sea carries the Vikings away, you remain, standing at the edge of a land that doesn't need to shout to be respected. The night hums softly, inviting you to keep walking, deeper into the north, where fear, belief, and survival intertwine. You move farther inland now, leaving the uneasy shoreline behind, and the world subtly rearranges itself around you. The forest thins, the ground opens into wide stretches of tundra, and the air feels quieter somehow, as if sound itself has decided to lie down and rest. This is where you begin to meet the people the Vikings feared, not as shadows or rumors, but as human beings moving calmly through their own landscape. You notice them before they notice you, which feels unlikely but comforting. A small group travels across the snow with an easy, practiced rhythm, their movements economical, almost graceful. Reindeer drift alongside them, not herded so much as accompanied. This is a mainstream historical fact, often missed in dramatic retellings. The Sámi were, and still are, Europe's only indigenous people traditionally practicing reindeer pastoralism. These animals are not just food or transport. They are woven into identity, economy, and survival. You stand there, trying not to look like a lost tourist who wandered off a scenic trail, and take in the details. Clothing is layered and practical, made from wool, leather, and fur, stitched with patterns that feel intentional rather than decorative. Nothing flashy, nothing wasted. The colors echo the land: earthy reds, muted blues, soft browns. Even fashion, it seems, knows how to keep a low profile up here. One of them turns toward you. There's no alarm, no dramatic hand reaching for a weapon. Just a steady look, curious but unbothered. You realize something important in that moment. Fear has mostly flowed in one direction. The Sámi know who the Vikings are. They've traded with them, watched them, learned their habits. The Vikings, meanwhile, have built entire mythologies out of half-understood encounters. A light joke slips in as you imagine explaining this to a Viking later. They weren't scary at all, just extremely competent. Not exactly saga material. You walk with them now, or at least you try to keep up. The pace is gentle but relentless, and your legs quickly learn the difference between modern comfort and ancient endurance. Camps appear and disappear with minimal fuss. Tents, lavvus they're called, rise quickly, conical and sturdy, designed to handle wind and snow without complaint. Archaeology backs this up. Sámi dwellings were intentionally temporary, allowing families to follow reindeer migrations without exhausting the land. Inside the camp, life unfolds quietly. Tools are repaired, food prepared, stories exchanged in low voices. There's warmth here, literal and emotional, but it's understated. No grand halls, no thrones, no kings. This is another key historical point. Sámi society was largely decentralized, organized around family groups rather than rigid hierarchies. For Vikings accustomed to chieftains and power displays, this lack of obvious authority felt unsettling. Who do you threaten when no one is clearly in charge? You notice a drum resting near the fire, its surface marked with symbols, animals, lines, shapes that seem to map both land and spirit. This brings us to a quirky tidbit that the sagas love to exaggerate. Sámi drums were believed by Norse writers to function like supernatural GPS devices, showing distant events or revealing hidden enemies. In reality, these drums were ritual tools used by Noidi, Sámi spiritual specialists, to enter trance states. Still, from an outsider's perspective, it probably looked like someone casually checking the universe for updates. Historians still argue whether the Sámi intentionally emphasized their spiritual practices to deter aggression, or whether Viking fear simply amplified what it didn't understand. Sitting here, watching daily life unfold, you sense the truth is probably somewhere in between. Power doesn't have to be loud to be effective. A second light joke drifts through as you imagine a Viking trying to raid this camp, only to realize there's nothing to steal that won't immediately freeze, wander off, or require years of specialized knowledge to use properly. As night, or something like it, settles in, stories emerge. They're not shouted performances, but quiet narratives, woven into the crackle of the fire. The Sámi relationship with the land comes through clearly. Mountains, rivers, and animals are not resources to conquer, but partners in an ongoing negotiation. This worldview contrasts sharply with the Viking mindset of claiming, owning, and naming. You begin to see why conquest here never quite took hold. There's another mainstream fact worth noting as you listen. Genetic and linguistic evidence shows long-term interaction between Norse and Sámi populations, including intermarriage and shared trade networks. This wasn't a hard border between enemies, it was a porous zone of contact. Fear coexisted with familiarity, which is often the most uncomfortable combination of all. You're offered food, simple, hearty, warming from the inside out. Reindeer meat, berries preserved against the cold, fat for energy. It's delicious, in that deeply satisfying way that makes you realize how hungry you actually were. A third gentle joke surfaces as you think, so this is what eating with the environment instead of against it feels like. As the fire burns lower, the drum is lifted. Not dramatically, not ceremonially, just naturally. A soft rhythm begins, steady and unhurried. It doesn't demand attention, but it holds it. Your breathing slows to match it. You understand now how stories of magic grew. When survival depends on harmony rather than domination, competence can look like sorcery to those who lack it. The Vikings, watching from a distance, saw people who thrived where they struggled, who vanished when pursued and appeared when least expected. That gap between experience and understanding became fear, and fear, left alone long enough, becomes legend. You settle into the quiet, realizing that meeting the Sámi isn't about terror at all. It's about encountering a different definition of strength, one that doesn't need long ships, walls, or songs of conquest. The fire dims, the drum slows, and the tundra stretches out around you, patient as ever. You don't have to wait long to understand how fear begins to ferment. It usually starts small, with a story told half seriously around a fire, then grows stronger each time it's repeated by someone who wasn't there. As you move alongside Norse traders skirting Sámi lands, you hear the same whispers again and again. These people don't just live in the north, they say. They control it. You walk with a group of Vikings now, your boots sinking into cold soil that smells faintly of moss and iron. The men keep their voices low, glancing at the sky more than usual, as if the clouds might be listening. This is where mainstream history settles in with a quiet thump. Norse sagas and medieval laws consistently associate the Sámi with sorcery, especially weather magic. To the Viking mind, this wasn't superstition, it was practical concern. Wind decided whether you lived or drowned. One sailor mutters about a voyage that went wrong. Calm seas turned violent without warning, sails snapping, oars ripped away like toys. He swears a Sámi trader had sold him a favorable wind just days earlier. This brings you to one of the strangest and most charmingly specific beliefs of the Viking Age, Sámi wind magic, sold in the form of knotted cords. Untie one knot for a breeze, another for stronger wind, and heaven help you if you loosen the third. It's a quirky tidbit that sounds almost whimsical, until you realize sailors were making real decisions based on it. You imagine a Viking standing on deck, hesitating over a rope, thinking, 2 knots feels safe, which might be the most relatable anxiety moment in medieval history. The Vikings don't laugh about it. Their fear is layered, almost respectful. They believe the Sámi can steal luck, dull weapons, and twist fate just enough to make a strong man stumble at the worst moment. This belief ties directly into Seiðr, a form of magic the Norse themselves practiced but deeply distrusted. Seiðr involved trance, prophecy, and the bending of natural forces. Powerful, yes, but also socially dangerous. Men who practiced it were often mocked or feared, accused of crossing boundaries that shouldn't be crossed. Historians still argue whether the Sámi truly practiced a distinct form of Seiðr that influenced Norse belief, or whether Vikings projected their anxieties onto a neighboring culture. Standing here, listening to these stories, you can feel how projection works. It fills in the gaps where understanding runs out. You notice how the Vikings behave differently in this region. They don't boast, they don't sing. Even the usual pre-raid rituals feel muted. Instead, they offer gifts, iron tools, beads, cloth, hoping to stay on good terms. This is another mainstream fact that often surprises people. Much of the Viking-Sámi relationship was based on trade rather than conquest. Furs, walrus ivory, and Arctic goods flowed south, while metal and grain flowed north. Fear didn't stop interaction, it shaped it. A light joke drifts in as you picture a Viking trying to act casual while handing over iron, like, no pressure, but please don't curse me. As night settles, a storm begins to gather. The wind rises quickly, tugging at cloaks and snapping branches. The Vikings exchange uneasy looks. Someone mutters a name under his breath, not a god, but a person. The idea that weather might be personal, controlled by someone who knows your name, is deeply unsettling. You feel it too. The storm doesn't feel random, it feels intentional, even if that's just your imagination leaning into the mood. Here's where the debate sharpens. Historians still argue whether Norse accounts of Sámi magic reflect genuine spiritual practices or strategic myth-making. By framing the Sámi as magically dangerous, Vikings may have justified their own caution, even cowardice, without admitting it outright. After all, it's easier to say they control the storms than we don't know how to survive here. The storm passes as quickly as it arrived. No one celebrates. Relief is quiet, almost embarrassed. A second light joke surfaces as you imagine the weather itself shrugging and moving on, uninterested in Viking drama. Later, you sit near a fire as an older Norseman tells a story of a Sámi Noidi who foresaw an ambush days before it happened, saving his people by simply not being there. Archaeology can't confirm prophecy, of course, but it does confirm patterns of avoidance. Sámi camps often shifted just ahead of approaching danger, suggesting deep environmental awareness rather than supernatural foresight. Still, to those watching from the outside, The difference is academic at best. You begin to see how fear becomes self-reinforcing. The Vikings expect magic, so every coincidence confirms it. A failed raid becomes a curse. A lost ship becomes a spell. Over time, the stories grow sharper, darker, more absolute. By the time they reach the Sagas, the Sámi are no longer just people, they're forces. A third gentle joke sneaks in as you imagine a Viking blaming magic for losing his socks, which, given the climate, might actually be a serious problem.
As you lie back, staring up at a sky smeared with faint light, you realize that terror doesn't always come from violence. Sometimes it comes from not being the most powerful presence in the room or the land. The Sámi didn't need to defeat the Vikings in battle. They only needed to remain unknowable. The fire crackles softly. The wind settles into a steady sigh. And somewhere between belief and reality, fear finds a comfortable place to sleep.
You find yourself drawn again to the quiet center of Sámi spiritual life, where nothing is announced and everything is implied. There's no grand temple, no towering idol, just a low fire, a circle of listening faces, and a drum resting where it can be reached without ceremony. The air smells faintly of smoke and resin, and your breath slows as if it knows this is a place for patience. The drum is lifted, not as a performance, but as a tool. This brings us to a mainstream historical fact that even careful scholars agree on. Sámi Noidi, or spiritual specialists, used frame drums in rituals meant to communicate with the spirit world, seek guidance, or heal. The drumhead, often made of reindeer hide, carries symbols representing animals, landscapes, and unseen forces. To those who understand it, it's a map. To outsiders, especially Vikings, it looked like a device for bending reality.
The rhythm begins softly, not dramatic, not fast, just a steady pulse that seems to echo your own heartbeat. You feel your shoulders drop, your jaw unclench. It's easy to imagine how this unsettled Norse observers. Viking rituals tended to be loud, chanting, feasting, blood sacrifices meant to impress gods who liked spectacle. This, by contrast, is inward, subtle, and quietly confident. A light joke drifts through as you imagine a Viking waiting for something exciting to happen, only to realize the excitement is entirely internal, deeply inconvenient for saga writing.
The Noidi closes their eyes, and the drumming shifts slightly, not faster, but deeper, as if the sound itself has learned to travel. This is where Seiðr enters the story again, and the lines blur. Seiðr, practiced by Norse seers and famously by the god Odin, involved trance, prophecy, and the manipulation of fate. It was powerful and taboo. Men who practiced it were often mocked or accused of moral weakness. The Sámi, however, seemed to embrace trance as a respected role, which made the Vikings deeply uncomfortable. Power without shame is unsettling when your own culture fears it.
Historians still argue whether Sámi spiritual practices directly influenced Norse Seiðr, or whether similarities arose independently in shamanic traditions across northern Eurasia. Sitting here, listening to the drum, the argument feels less important than the experience. The rhythm works, whether you analyze it or not. You notice how the environment participates. The wind threads through the trees in time with the beat. The fire flickers, but doesn't flare. Even the reindeer nearby seem calmer, chewing slowly, eyes half-lidded. This connection between ritual and landscape is another well-supported historical understanding. Sámi spirituality was deeply animistic, viewing natural features as alive and responsive. Mountains weren't just obstacles, they had personalities. Rivers weren't just routes, they had moods. A quirky tidbit surfaces here, one the Vikings found particularly unnerving. Norse sources claim Sámi shamans could send their spirits out of their bodies to spy or attack from afar. This idea of spiritual travel terrified people whose worldview depended on physical boundaries. You can't fight what isn't fully present. It's like trying to duel a thought. You imagine a Viking warrior gripping his axe a little tighter, wondering if it's even useful against something that might not be standing in front of him. Not a comforting thought.
The drumming slows, then stops. No applause, no declaration. The new deity opens their eyes, looking slightly tired but calm. The ritual ends the same way it began, quietly. And yet you feel different, as if the air itself has been rearranged. This subtlety is key. The Sámi didn't need spectacle to make an impression. Their rituals worked precisely because they didn't announce themselves.
Another mainstream fact settles in here. Many Sámi drums were confiscated and destroyed centuries later during Christianization efforts, precisely because they were seen as dangerously effective symbols of pagan power. Fear of these objects outlived the Viking Age by hundreds of years. That alone tells you something about their impact. A second gentle joke slips in as you imagine a medieval bishop staring at a drum and thinking, absolutely not, which might be the most decisive moment in church history. As night deepens, stories are shared, quietly, indirectly. Tales of animals guiding lost travelers, of storms avoided by listening to the land, of dreams that arrive carrying advice rather than prophecy. None of it sounds dramatic. None of it needs to. You begin to understand how the Vikings, listening from a distance, filled in the gaps with their own fears. Historians still argue whether Norse fear as Sámi magic was exaggerated to excuse failed raids, or whether genuine encounters left lasting psychological scars. The truth likely lies in the repetition. When enough people believe something is dangerous, it becomes dangerous to ignore. A third light joke floats through as you imagine a Viking trying to explain all this back home, only to be interrupted with, "So, did you get any silver?" To which the answer is an awkward, "No, but the vibes were intense." The fire burns low. The drum rests again, just an object now, its power folded back into stillness. You lie back, watching sparks drift upward and vanish. The land feels steady, unbothered by your thoughts or fears. And in that calm, you understand something crucial. What terrified the Vikings wasn't magic alone. It was a worldview they couldn't dominate, predict, or fully understand. The rhythm lingers in your chest long after the sound fades, slow and steady, guiding you deeper into the quiet north. You wake to a pale light that never quite decided to be morning. It seeps across the land like a careful guest, touching the snow, the moss, the low hills, without ever raising its voice. The fire from the night before has collapsed into warm ash, and the air carries that clean, almost metallic cold that makes every breath feel deliberate. This is the landscape itself stepping forward, ready to explain why it never needed walls or armies. You set out across the tundra, and it immediately becomes clear that this place doesn't welcome impatience. The ground shifts beneath your feet, sometimes frozen solid, sometimes soft and treacherous, hiding pools of icy water under a thin crust. You move slowly, instinctively, large-scale military campaigns extremely difficult. Armies need roads, supply lines, and predictable seasons. The tundra offers none of those. The Vikings knew this. Their strength lay in speed and surprise, in striking coastal settlements and moving on before resistance could organize. Here, speed works against you. Surprise fades when visibility stretches for miles, and every misstep leaves a trail. You can't rush across land that punishes haste with injury or worse. A light joke surfaces as you imagine a Viking warrior built for rowing and raiding, discovering that trudging through boggy tundra is a very different skill set. "I miss boats," he mutters, adjusting his cloak for the 10th time. The Sámi move differently. You watch them cross this same terrain with an ease that looks like magic if you don't know what you're seeing. They know where the ground holds, where it gives, where snow hides water and where it doesn't. This isn't instinct. It's accumulated knowledge passed down over generations.
Archaeological and ethnographic evidence confirms this deep environmental understanding, from seasonal migration routes to specialized footwear designed for snow and ice. You notice how quiet everything is. Not silent, just muted. Sound doesn't travel the same way here. Wind absorbs it. Snow swallows it. Even your own footsteps feel private. This quiet becomes a defense in itself. An approaching group is hard to hear, easy to miss. For Vikings accustomed to announcing their arrival with oars, shouts, and clashing shields, this silence is disorienting. A quirky tidbit surfaces here. Norse sagas describe Sámi as being able to hide entire camps, making them invisible to enemies. While that sounds supernatural, historians still argue whether this refers to actual concealment techniques, choosing terrain, timing movement, or to the psychological effect of searching a vast, empty landscape where people simply aren't where you expect them to be. The cold deepens as you move. It's not dramatic, not a howling blizzard, just persistent. Cold that seeps, that waits. You realize another uncomfortable truth for would-be invaders. The environment does the fighting for the Sámi. Hypothermia, exhaustion, and disorientation don't care how brave you are. They work slowly, efficiently, and without malice. A second gentle joke drifts in as you imagine the land itself filing a complaint. You're not prepared for this, stamped repeatedly on frozen ground. You pause near a stand of sparse trees, their branches twisted by wind and time. From here, you can see for miles, and yet it feels like the land is watching you more than you're watching it. This sense of exposure is another psychological barrier. There's nowhere to hide unless you know exactly where to go. The Sámi do, outsiders don't. Mainstream history backs this up with quiet numbers. There's little evidence of permanent Viking settlements deep in Sámi territory. Trading posts appear at the edges, where forests thicken and routes make sense, but the open tundra remains largely untouched. Fear of magic may have played a role, but so did practical survival math. Historians still argue whether Viking restraint here was driven more by belief or by logistics. Was it the drumbeats and stories that stopped them, or the simple realization that conquest would cost more than it could ever return? Walking here, feeling the cold settle into your bones, the answer feels obvious. Probably both. A third light joke flickers through as you imagine a Viking leader trying to motivate his crew. There's nothing to loot, nowhere to build, and the ground hates us. But onward. Not exactly inspiring.
As the light begins to fade again, though you're never entirely sure, it becomes clear that the land doesn't need to chase anyone away. It just waits. Time stretches. The Sámi understand this rhythm. They move when it's time, rest when it's time, and let the land do the rest. Patience becomes a form of power. You sit down, letting the cold seep in just enough to remind you that survival here is an active process. You have to listen, adjust, and accept that you're not in charge. The Vikings sensed this imbalance. Their fear of Sámi magic was in part fear of a place that refused to be mastered.
The tundra breathes slowly around you. Wind brushes the ground. Somewhere in the distance, reindeer move like shadows. The landscape itself stands as the quietest, most reliable guardian. A presence that doesn't threaten, doesn't boast, and never needs to explain itself. You don't always meet fear with steel. Sometimes you meet it with a bundle of goods, laid carefully on the ground, hands open, postured deliberately calm. That's how trade begins here, slowly, cautiously, with everyone pretending they're not thinking about all the ways this could go wrong. You stand at the edge of a clearing where Norse traders and Sámi families gather, not quite together, not quite apart. The distance between them is polite, measured. No one crosses it too quickly. This is a mainstream historical fact, supported by both archaeology and written sources. Vikings and Sámi maintained long-standing trade relationships,
exchanging iron tools, weapons, grain, and cloth for furs, hides, and Arctic resources like walrus ivory. These weren't rare encounters, they were regular, if tense, interactions.
The goods speak first. Iron knives catch the light. Woven cloth adds a rare softness of color to the landscape. In return, thick furs are laid out, dense and warm, the kind that makes southern winters survivable. You can almost feel the unspoken calculation on both sides. Trade here isn't about profit alone, it's about balance. Push too hard, and the relationship breaks. Break it, and you lose access to an entire region. A light joke drifts in as you imagine a Viking trying to haggle aggressively, only to realize the other side can simply pack up and leave, taking the entire economy with them. There's a subtle tension under everything. The Vikings don't arrive unarmed, but their weapons stay sheathed. The Sámi don't display weapons at all, which somehow feels more intimidating. Eye contact is brief, respectful. Words are exchanged carefully, often through gestures or shared trade languages that develop over time. Mainstream history tells us these contact zones created hybrid cultures, where ideas, tools, and even beliefs flowed both ways. You notice how tribute enters the picture. In some regions, Norse chieftains claimed authority over Sámi groups, demanding taxes in the form of furs. But this authority was often more theoretical than real. Historians still argue whether these tribute systems represented actual control or were simply Norse self-congratulation written into later records. Standing here, watching the careful equality of the exchange, it's hard to imagine anyone truly being in charge. A quirky tidbit surfaces. Some Norse sources describe Sámi traders deliberately exaggerating their mystical reputation during negotiations. A hint dropped here, a knowing look there. Whether true or not, it's a brilliant strategy. If the other side thinks you might curse their livestock, they're more likely to accept your terms. You sense how this dynamic keeps violence at bay. Trade creates dependence. Dependence creates restraint. Raiding a trading partner who controls vital resources in a harsh climate is a short-sighted move. The Vikings, pragmatic as ever, understood this. Fear and economics often walked hand in hand. A second gentle joke floats through as you imagine a Viking explaining this to a more aggressive companion. Yes, we could attack them, but then winter would kill us, which tends to end arguments quickly. As goods change hands, stories are exchanged too. News from the south, rumors from the coast, hints of shifting alliances. Information travels along these trade routes as reliably as any ship. The Sámi, often portrayed as isolated, are anything but. They know who's rising, who's fallen, and who's not worth trusting this season. Mainstream archaeological evidence supports this interconnectedness. Norse-made objects appear in Sámi contexts far inland, while Sámi goods show up in Viking towns. This wasn't a world of sealed borders. It was a web of cautious relationships. The fear the Vikings felt didn't prevent contact. It shaped it into something careful and negotiated. Historians still argue whether Viking avoidance of Sámi lands was a sign of respect, fear, or strategic patience. Watching trade unfold, you realize it might be all three at once. Respect keeps tempers in check. Fear discourages betrayal. Strategy ensures long-term survival.
A third light joke slips in as you imagine a Viking thinking, "This is the least dramatic interaction I've ever had, and somehow the most stressful." As the exchange winds down, there's no handshake, no ceremony. People simply step back, goods secured, eyes still watchful. The distance remains. No one overstays their welcome. This too is part of the system. Familiarity is allowed, but never assumed. You walk away from the clearing with a deeper understanding of how peace survives in difficult places, not through trust alone, but through mutual awareness of consequences. The Vikings may have feared Sámi magic, but they also respected Sámi leverage, geographical, economic, and cultural.
The clearing empties. The tundra absorbs the last footprints. Trade ends as quietly as it began, leaving behind no monument, no record, just the continuation of a relationship balanced on caution
and necessity. You don't hear the stories out here first. You hear them later, farther south, when the land softens, the fires burn higher, and people feel safe enough to exaggerate. That's where the Sámi truly become frightening, around Viking hearths, in long houses heavy with smoke and memory, where a good tale is meant to linger longer than the truth.
You sit among Norse families as winter presses in. The walls are thick, the air warm, and the mead flows freely. Someone clears their throat and begins to speak about the people of the north. Not neighbors, not traitors, others. This is where mainstream history meets storytelling. Medieval Norse sagas and poems regularly describe the Sámi as shadowy, magical, and not quite human. They appear at the edges of stories, guiding heroes, cursing enemies, or vanishing into mist. The language used is telling. Sámi are often associated with darkness, secrecy. The language used is telling. Sámi are often associated with darkness, secrecy, and hidden knowledge. They're rarely given names, rarely given voices. This isn't accidental. By keeping them vague, the stories keep them powerful. A named character can be argued with, a shadow cannot. A light joke drifts in as you imagine a Viking storyteller realizing that the less he explains, the scarier the story becomes. They were north, he says ominously, and everyone nods, satisfied.
You listen as one saga recounts a hero seeking out Sámi magic to gain an advantage. This is another mainstream fact tucked into the literature. Vikings didn't just fear Sámi sorcery, they sought it. Kings and warriors traveled north to consult Sámi seers, hoping for prophecy or magical aid. Fear and desire, as usual, are close cousins. A quirky tidbit surfaces in these tales. Sámi characters often live alone or in small, isolated groups, reinforcing the idea that they exist outside normal society. In reality, Sámi social networks were complex and far-reaching, but isolation makes a better story. It suggests secrecy, and secrecy invites imagination.
Historians still argue whether these saga portrayals reflect genuine encounters or literary tropes borrowed from older myth traditions. The Sámi may have been folded into pre-existing categories of otherworldly beings, filling a narrative role rather than representing real people. Sitting here, you can feel how easily that happens. When someone lives beyond your daily experience, they become a canvas for your fears.
The stories grow darker as the night deepens. Sámi are said to change shape, to send sickness, to see events unfolding miles away. None of this is presented with proof. It doesn't need to be. The listeners nod, eyes wide, already half convinced. You realize something quietly important. These stories aren't warnings against the Sámi. They're explanations for failure. A bad harvest, a lost ship, a raid that never happened. Blame magic, and no one questions your competence. A second gentle joke floats in as you imagine a Viking blaming a missed fishing trip on a curse rather than admitting he overslept.
There's a pattern in the sagas. Sámi appear at moments of uncertainty, when heroes step beyond the known world. They mark thresholds between land and sea, known and unknown, success and disaster. This literary function reinforces fear by association. Every time something goes wrong near the northern edge, the Sámi are already waiting in the story. Mainstream scholarship points out another detail. These depictions intensified over time. Earlier references are more neutral, even respectful. Later medieval texts grow more fantastical. This suggests that as direct contact decreased, imagination filled the gap. Fear thrives in absence.
Historians still argue whether Christianization played a role in this shift. As Norse society converted, older spiritual practices were rebranded as sinister. The Sámi, who retained their traditions longer, became convenient symbols of pagan danger. Sitting here, listening to these stories, you sense how theology quietly reshapes fear. A third light joke drifts in as you imagine a monk furiously rewriting a saga margin. Definitely evil, trust me.
By the time the fire burns low, the Sámi of the stories barely resemble the people you walked with on the Tundra. They're taller, darker, more mysterious. They wield power effortlessly and without explanation, and because no one here has seen them recently, no one argues. You step outside into the cold night, the contrast jarring. The stars are sharp. The world is quiet again. You realize that the Sámi who truly frightened the Vikings may not have been the people themselves, but the idea of them, shaped, polished, and sharpened by storytelling. Fear, once turned into narrative, becomes portable. It travels farther than any longboat. It settles into minds that have never seen the tundra, never heard the drum, never felt the quiet confidence of a people at home in their land. And so the stories continue, passed from fire to fire, growing heavier with each retelling, until the shadow they cast is far larger than the reality that inspired them. You step away from the longhouse fires and the sagas that cling to them, carrying their shadows with you, and return to the quieter work of noticing what actually remains. Here, away from stories, fear loses its dramatic lighting. It has to stand on evidence instead. You walk through places where Vikings passed through, traded, maybe paused, but did not stay. The ground is unscarred. No burned foundations, no collapsed halls. This absence becomes its own kind of presence. A mainstream historical fact settles in gently. Archaeological surveys across northern Scandinavia show remarkably little evidence of Viking raids or permanent settlements deep in Sámi territory. Compared to the destruction documented elsewhere in the Viking world, the quiet here is striking. You kneel and brush snow aside, finding traces of Sámi life instead. Hearths reused over generations, tool fragments, migration paths etched into the land rather than built upon it. These aren't signs of people hiding in fear. They're signs of people living efficiently, without excess. The contrast with saga imagery is almost comical. A light joke drifts in as you imagine a saga author staring at this evidence and muttering, "Well, that ruins the drama." The Vikings, for all their reputation, were practical. They went where profit outweighed risk. England offered monasteries full of silver. Francia offered cities and tribute. Sámi lands offered cold, distance, and people who knew exactly when to leave. Strip away the magic for a moment, and the decision not to conquer starts to look like common sense. This is where fear versus reality becomes interesting. The Vikings genuinely believed in Sámi magic, but belief doesn't exist in a vacuum. It's shaped by experience. When every encounter ends without clear victory, when people disappear before you arrive, when storms hit at inconvenient times, belief hardens into explanation. A quirky tidbit surfaces here. Some archaeologists suggest that Viking avoidance of Sámi regions may have actually preserved Sámi culture more effectively than resistance ever could have. By not being conquered outright, traditions continued largely intact. Fear, in this case, acted like a cultural conservation policy. Historians still argue whether Vikings overestimated Sámi power or simply recognized a form of strength they couldn't easily counter. After all, conquest requires not just winning battles, but holding land. You need farms, infrastructure, and steady supply lines. None of those thrive easily in tundra and taiga. You follow an old route along a river, imagining Viking traders moving cautiously, sticking to known paths. They don't wander. They don't explore for fun. Their world narrows here, guided by necessity rather than ambition. This isn't terror in the cinematic sense, it's restraint, and restraint rarely makes it into heroic stories. A second gentle joke slips in as you imagine a Viking scout reporting back. Good news, we survived. Bad news, there's nothing to conquer. The Sámi, meanwhile, continue their cycles. Camps shift with the seasons. Tools wear down and are replaced. Life adapts. The land remembers them, not through monuments, but through patterns. This subtle presence is easy to miss if you're looking for drama. It's also easy to misunderstand if you're writing from a distance. Mainstream scholarship points out that many saga writers lived centuries after the events they described. Their understanding of the Sámi came filtered through older texts,
Christian ideology, and cultural bias. Over time, practical caution transformed into mystical fear, reality blurred.
Historians still argue whether Viking fear was sincere belief or rhetorical device. Did they truly think Sámi magic could kill them, or did the stories simply provide a socially acceptable reason not to push northward? Sitting here, you realize the answer doesn't have to be one or the other. Belief and convenience often reinforce each other. A third light joke drifts through, as you imagine fear doing a very reasonable job interview. I prevent risky decisions and protect cultural boundaries, which honestly sounds impressive. You stand and look across the land again. The wind moves slowly. Snow settles. Nothing dramatic happens. And yet, this quiet endurance explains more than any saga ever could. The Sámi didn't terrify the Vikings because they were monstrous or supernatural. They terrified them because they couldn't be easily turned into subjects, enemies, or stories that ended neatly. Reality rarely matches fear. It's usually more complex, more human, and far less interested in proving a point. As you walk on, you carry both versions with you, the shadow and the substance, knowing that history often lives somewhere in between.
You pause now in that in-between space where certainty thins out and arguments begin. This is where historians gather, centuries later, brushing dust from fragments and asking the same question in different ways. Why, exactly, did the Vikings stop here? Not just slow down, not just trade, but stop short of domination. You imagine yourself sitting at a long table, maps spread out, voices low but animated. One historian taps the parchment and says it was belief, fear of Sámi magic, deeply ingrained and culturally reinforced. Another shakes their head and says logistics, pure and simple. No farmland, no tribute worth the effort, no reason to stay. A third leans back and reminds everyone that humans rarely act for just one reason at a time.
This debate is a mainstream feature of modern scholarship. Historians still argue whether Viking restraint in Sámi regions was driven primarily by supernatural fear, environmental challenge, economic calculation, or some blend of all three. The lack of decisive evidence keeps the conversation alive, looping gently rather than landing hard. You walk the land again with these voices in your head. It feels different now, layered with interpretation. Every quiet valley becomes an argument. Every absence of ruins becomes a footnote. A light joke floats in as you imagine the land itself listening to the debate and responding, "You're all overthinking it," which the land says to everyone eventually. Those who argue for belief point to the Sagas. They note how consistently Sámi magic appears, how often it's treated as real and dangerous. In a worldview where gods intervene daily and fate is negotiable, fear of sorcery isn't irrational, it's strategic. If you believe someone can tilt luck against you, you avoid provoking them. Simple as that. Those who argue for logistics counter with maps and climate data. They point out that Viking expansion followed arable land and navigable rivers. Where crops grow, kingdoms follow. Where they don't, stories replace settlements. This is another mainstream historical observation. Viking colonization patterns align closely with agricultural viability. Sámi lands offered little incentive for that kind of expansion. Some scholars suggest that Viking fear narratives may have been deliberately cultivated by Norse elites to discourage uncontrolled northern ventures. Better to trade under chieftain oversight than have young men vanish chasing glory in a land that offers none. Fear, in this sense, becomes policy. You imagine a chieftain nodding gravely while saying, "Yes, very dangerous magic up there," conveniently steering ambition elsewhere. The debate deepens when identity enters the room. The Sámi weren't just geographically distant, they were culturally distinct in ways that resisted easy assimilation. Their mobile lifestyle, decentralized authority, and spiritual worldview didn't mesh with Norse systems of control. Historians still argue whether this incompatibility itself created fear, or whether fear was used to justify exclusion. You notice how the arguments begin to overlap. Belief influences strategy, strategy reinforces belief.
Economics quietly shapes both. It's less a tidy equation and more a slow feedback loop. A second gentle joke drifts in as you imagine a historian declaring victory in the debate only to be immediately contradicted by another footnote. As you move through the tundra again, you realize that the question might be slightly off. Instead of asking why the Vikings didn't conquer, maybe the better question is why they felt they needed to explain it so thoroughly. England, Francia, and Ireland didn't require mystical excuses. Success speaks for itself. Failure, or restraint, demands narrative. Mainstream history reminds us that Viking identity was built around expansion and reputation. To choose not to conquer required justification. Magic provided that justification elegantly. It preserved the image of strength while acknowledging limits. A third light joke slips in as you imagine a Viking saying, "We could have won, but it wasn't worth it," which might be the most historically accurate sentence never written down. You sit with the debate as it softens. The wind moves over the land, uninterested in arguments. Snow settles, erasing tracks, erasing conclusions. The Sámi continue their cycles, unaffected by scholarly disagreement. In the end, the question remains open not because evidence is lacking, but because human motivation is layered. Fear can be sincere and useful. Respect can coexist with avoidance. Strategy can feel like belief when it's lived deeply enough. You breathe in the cold air and let the debate fade into the background hum of history, present, unresolved, and oddly comforting in its refusal to settle. You move now into the quieter stories, the ones that linger in margins and whispered conversations, rather than bold, epic poems. These are tales of encounters that went wrong, not catastrophically, but just enough to leave an impression, the kind of events that teach you how caution and unpredictability can outweigh courage. A group of Vikings, you imagine, approached a Sámi settlement expecting a routine trade or a simple show of force. They stepped off their boats with swords glinting, confident in past victories, only to discover that the tents had shifted overnight, smoke drifting in unfamiliar directions, and no one to negotiate with. This is a mainstream historical fact, supported by accounts of Norse interactions with mobile northern populations. Sámi communities were often intentionally transient, moving with the seasons and their herds. This mobility made them difficult targets, frustrating for any outsider relying on permanence to plan raids or conquest. You follow their movements as if tracing shadows. Paths that looked clear yesterday are now obscured by snow and frost. A small group crosses your line of sight, but they vanish into the trees before you can call out. Quirky, almost mischievous details emerge in sagas and folklore. Some Vikings believed the Sámi could literally disappear from sight, slipping into the landscape with the help of magic. Scholars still argue whether these were clever concealment techniques or later embellishments added to create suspense and awe. Either way, it shapes the story. A light joke drifts into your thoughts. Imagine a Viking grumbling to his companion, "They're everywhere and nowhere, and my sword refuses to follow them," which, to be honest, might be how he felt. The encounters don't always involve outright hostility. Sometimes they are misunderstandings amplified by fear. A Viking mistaking a snowbank for a lurking Sámi figure. A Sámi group seeing strangers near their camps and preparing defensive measures. No one dies, but tension hangs like frost on pine branches. Mainstream evidence suggests many such confrontations never escalated to violence, leaving only tales of retreat or unexplained mishap. The geography itself conspires. Snow, marshes, and uneven terrain slow pursuit. Streams freeze unevenly. Hidden bogs wait like slow traps. Every step requires attention, and the more confident you feel, the easier it is to misstep. Historians still argue whether these environmental challenges were more effective than any magical reputation in keeping Vikings at bay. Standing in the frozen landscape, you can feel how both combine into a subtle but persistent deterrent. A second gentle joke drifts in.
Envision a Viking stepping cautiously over ice, only to realize the Sámi have already gone ahead, leaving no signs and apparently mocking him silently.
Sometimes, encounters left physical reminders: discarded weapons, hastily abandoned trade goods, or a longboat returning with reports of unusually difficult conditions. Quirky saga details embellish these incidents. A Norseman claims he was cursed to lose his way for 3 days, only finding his path after reciting prayers. Reality likely involved snowstorms, frozen rivers, or simple misnavigation. Yet the Viking interpretation made for compelling retelling. By nightfall, the Vikings retreat, often silently, humbled more by circumstance than by conflict. A third light joke surfaces as you imagine a frustrated warrior muttering, "We came, we saw, we were slightly inconvenienced." You realize, standing in the snow and listening to distant reindeer bells, that these failed encounters form the backbone of the Vikings' cautionary tales. No battle needed to instill respect. The Sámi didn't fight in the conventional sense. Their knowledge, mobility, and environment acted as their shield. Every misstep, miscalculation, or surprise encounter reinforced the idea that this northern frontier was different, untamable, and most importantly, to be treated carefully.
The wind moves through the sparse trees, carrying the quiet echo of retreating footsteps and the lingering impression of restraint. Fear here is subtle, cumulative, and in the end, profoundly effective. You can see why stories of terrifying magic and supernatural ability grew out of what were really careful, measured responses to a landscape that never yielded to force.
You begin to notice the rhythm of the Sámi year as you move with them, or at least observe it closely from a cautious distance. Their life is paced not by kings, conquests, or sagas, but by seasons, animal migrations, and the subtle cues of wind, snow, and ice. Mainstream historical evidence confirms that the Sámi followed highly organized seasonal patterns, moving camps with their reindeer herds, fishing where the rivers thawed, and harvesting where plants offered sustenance. To an outsider, it appears almost choreographed, effortless, and precise. You trudge alongside imagined snowbanks and frozen streams, thinking about how these cycles dictate everything. Vikings, by contrast, often relied on aggressive, linear campaigns, planning years ahead but expecting the world to stay roughly in place. Here, the world does not pause for anyone. The Sámi move with it. That difference alone, subtle as it seems, builds a layer of unease. A light joke drifts in as you picture a Viking trying to schedule a raid, only to find the target village has already migrated to a completely different valley. "Well, that's inconvenient," he mutters, which, historically speaking, might be the understatement of the century. The camps themselves are deceptively simple. Small, conical tents called lavvus rise with minimal effort, designed to handle wind, rain, and snow. Reindeer are tethered in ways that maximize grazing and mobility. The layout is practical rather than ornamental. Yet for a Viking used to permanent fortifications, every element of impermanence seems unnerving. You start to see why stories exaggerated their magical ability to vanish. It wasn't sorcery. It was practical planning, made mysterious by unfamiliarity. A quirky tidbit emerges. Some Sámi communities would strategically leave tracks or misleading paths to confuse outsiders. This may have been a simple technique for managing curiosity or protecting the herd, but Vikings often interpreted such moves as deliberate enchantment. Historians still argue whether tales of Sámi vanishing paths were based on clever landscape navigation or exaggeration over time. Either way, it feeds the narrative of an untouchable people.
You notice how silence functions as another layer of defense. The Sámi speak softly, if at all, when moving. Tools are used with care. Fire is minimal and carefully tended. The tundra itself absorbs sound. To an untrained ear, it seems as though the people are floating rather than walking. Fear, once again, is amplified by perception. A second gentle joke drifts through your thoughts. Imagine a Viking exasperatedly whispering to his companion, "I think they're everywhere, or nowhere."
possibly both, which captures the essence of confusion perfectly.
Trade punctuates these seasonal movements. A Sámi group may meet Vikings at the edge of the forest or along the river, exchanging furs, ivory, or fish for metal tools and cloth. These interactions are polite, cautious, and deliberate. Mainstream evidence shows that these exchanges were regular but limited. Fear didn't prevent contact, it shaped it. The Vikings understood the balance. Too aggressive, and the network collapses. Too timid, an opportunity is lost. By midwinter, survival itself becomes a subtle form of power. Knowledge of ice thickness, snow consistency, and the habits of reindeer is the difference between life and death. This expertise, mundane as it may seem, appears magical to outsiders. You realize that skill becomes reputation. Mastery over environment is indistinguishable from sorcery if your frame of reference is different.
Historians still argue whether the perception of Sámi invincibility arose more from practical competence or from legendary storytelling. Standing here, feeling the cold seep into your bones while imagining them navigating it with ease, you start to think the line between skill and myth is thin and deliberately blurred. A third light joke surfaces as you imagine a Viking muttering, "I survived the tundra once. It was probably cursed," which seems fitting given the circumstances. You breathe in the crisp, clean air, feeling the quiet efficiency of a people whose lives are a continuous negotiation with the land. The combination of patience, mobility, and acute observation makes them appear omnipotent to anyone conditioned to measure strength by force. And in that quiet, you begin to understand why the Vikings left much of the north intact, trading respect and fear instead of conquest. You follow the subtle trails left by Sámi knowledge, the invisible lines etched into the landscape by generations of observation. Every frozen river bend, every hidden spring, every patch of moss carries a story of survival. Mainstream historical evidence confirms that Sámi navigation relied on deep environmental literacy rather than compasses or maps. They read the land the way others read books, and every feature became a tool, a guide, a warning. You trudge carefully, feeling the texture of snow underfoot, listening to the soft snap of branches. This attentiveness is a lesson in humility. The Vikings, who were used to measuring strength by the number of shields in a formation or the might of their oars, found this kind of mastery quietly terrifying. There is no fanfare here. There is only competence, and competence is unnerving when you can't measure it. A light joke surfaces as you imagine a Viking muttering to himself, "I can build a fort in a day, but I can't figure out which way that river is flowing," which perfectly captures that subtle frustration. The Sámi's spiritual practices reinforce this perception. Not dramatic rituals, but small, deliberate acts. A drumbeat timed to the wind, an offering left near a spring, a whispered prayer to unseen forces. These are mainstream facts, supported by ethnographic records. Ritual and daily life were intertwined, creating a seamless worldview where the spiritual and practical coexisted. Outsiders often interpreted this integration as magical because the cause and effect were not immediately visible. A quirky tidbit emerges. Some sagas describe Sámi Noiri who could supposedly stop the moon from rising or make the northern lights dance angrily. Of course, these are literary flourishes, yet they echo the respect and unease generated by people whose understanding of the environment and timing surpassed that of outsiders. Historians still argue whether these stories originated from genuine magical belief, exaggeration, or a combination of both. The line between observation and myth blurs in the cold northern light. You notice how social structures reinforce survival. Leadership is situational. Decisions rotate according to knowledge and expertise, not rank or inherited status. This flexibility is a subtle form of strength. Vikings, accustomed to rigid hierarchies and chieftains making absolute decisions, found it difficult to predict the outcome of any interaction. Fear grows in uncertainty. A second gentle joke drifts in as you imagine a Viking shouting, "Who's in charge here?" only to receive a polite, "It depends," which, historically speaking, would be maddening.
Trade punctuates the rhythm of life. Seasonal fairs and occasional bartering points act as controlled intersections between Sámi and outsiders. These interactions are careful, deliberate, and mutually beneficial, but they are tightly regulated. Mainstream evidence confirms that such exchanges rarely escalated to conflict, because the Sámi controlled when and how outsiders entered their domain. Fear, coupled with respect for their organization, ensured compliance.
Environmental mastery extends to wildlife too. Hunters track patterns with near-perfect intuition, predicting movements that would seem impossible to the untrained eye. Reindeer, fish, and birds are both sustenance and lesson. Quirky sagas interpreted this skill as supernatural foresight, but in reality, it's patience and attentiveness. Historians still argue whether Viking awe reflected actual supernatural fear or simply admiration for a culture they could not easily conquer. A third light joke drifts through your thoughts. Imagine a Viking exclaiming, "I swear that bird just looked at me funny," as if divine insight were involved.
As you trudge on, you sense the quiet lessons of endurance, observation, and adaptation. Fear, in the Viking mind, was not about violence or brutality. It was about being outmatched in subtle ways that could never be fully countered. And that is a far deeper kind of terror than any battle could produce.
You move further into the subtleties of Sámi influence, the quiet corridors where fear intersects with respect, and where storytelling becomes a tool for both. Out here, nothing is overt. Everything communicates in suggestion. Every footstep, every drift of smoke, every pause in conversation carries information. Mainstream historical records support this. Sámi communities operated with a social fluidity and observational skill that outsiders often misinterpreted as magical control. Their ability to anticipate events, respond swiftly, and adapt to changing conditions impressed and unnerved anyone who tried to follow.
You imagine a Viking trader navigating a snowy pass. He consults the stars, reads the wind, checks the terrain, yet still finds himself off course. There's no sign of malevolence, just environmental mastery beyond his experience. A light joke surfaces. "I'm a navigator," he mutters, but apparently the snow disagrees. Practical competence, when combined with unfamiliar cultural cues, can be terrifying, especially when your assumptions keep failing. Stories travel back south with each encounter. Tales of invisible camps, disappearing hunters, and premonitions of storms gain narrative weight. Quirky tidbits persist. Some accounts claim Sámi could sense a Viking boat from miles away, adjusting their movements to avoid, or sometimes meet, the intruders. Scholars still argue whether these accounts reflect genuine supernatural belief, clever environmental adaptation, or a blend of both. The line between practical skill and myth is blurred not just by imagination, but by the need for explanation. You step lightly across frozen streams, thinking about mobility as both survival strategy and source of fear. The Sámi don't simply evade, they anticipate. Reindeer paths, snowdrift patterns, and seasonal migration all function as predictive systems. For a Viking trained in aggression and conquest, such foresight seems uncanny. Historians point out that mobility itself served as a defensive mechanism, a way to maintain autonomy in a harsh climate. A second gentle joke drifts in. Imagine a Viking grumbling, "They moved again. I'll give them points for commitment." It's small humor, but it reflects a subtle truth. Fear need not be violent to be effective. Communication is layered. Signals, small fires, drum beats, and even footprints relay meaning without speech. You realize that in such a system, secrecy is power. Outsiders misinterpret it as mysticism. Mainstream evidence shows this is an efficient form of social control, practical and low cost, but interpreted through Norse imagination as enchantment or manipulation. Trade interactions further reinforce this dual perception of fear and respect. Vikings who visited knew to offer gifts, not threats. Even then, exchanges were bounded by trust, observation, and timing. Quirky saga details suggest that some Vikings thought the Sámi could reject items magically, But in reality, they simply refused or redirected trade according to rules the visitors did not fully understand.
Historians still argue whether Viking fear of the Sámi derived more from social structure, environmental mastery, or perceived magical ability. Standing in the silent snow, watching imagined patterns of movement, it becomes clear it was all of these things. Fear arose not from brute force, but from living in a world where you could never predict outcomes completely. A third light joke drifts through your imagination. "I'm fairly certain I'm outsmarted by people who aren't even trying," mutters a Viking, which is historically credible in its understated way.
You pause and watch the wind move across the tundra. Every subtle shift seems meaningful, every frozen ridge a lesson in restraint. Fear in this northern landscape is quiet, cumulative, and inescapable, an omnipresent teacher shaping decisions more effectively than any sword or siege engine ever could. You wander now along the northern edge, where the land opens into wide tundra plains and sparse forests, and it occurs to you how much of fear depends on anticipation. The Vikings never knew what to expect, and that uncertainty, as much as any sword, kept them cautious. Mainstream historical evidence suggests that this unpredictability was a deliberate feature of Sámi life. Mobility, seasonal movement, and an intimate knowledge of the environment created an ever-shifting landscape that outsiders could not master. You imagine a Viking party approaching a frozen river, expecting to follow a well-worn trail. Instead, the ice shifts, cracks, and hides deeper snowbanks beneath thin surfaces. Their confidence falters. Each misstep reinforces a lesson that is both practical and psychological. The land itself is an obstacle, and those who know it are effectively invisible. Quirky tidbits in Sagas describe Sámi guiding wolves or spirits to mislead invaders, exaggerations likely born from these environmental challenges. Historians still argue whether these accounts describe actual events, metaphorical storytelling, or a combination of both, but the effect on perception was undeniable. A light joke drifts in as you imagine a Viking exclaiming, "I didn't think snow could conspire against me," which, in a world measured by battles and raids, is a novel kind of frustration. The social dynamics of Sámi communities compound this effect. Small, decentralized groups communicate efficiently, making rapid adjustments as needed. They are egalitarian and flexible, moving according to knowledge rather than hierarchy. To a Viking accustomed to clear chains of command and decisive action, this fluidity is confounding. You realize that fear is amplified when your expectations are constantly subverted. Mainstream studies show that such adaptability was a survival strategy embedded deeply into both daily life and seasonal planning. You notice how even minor rituals underscore the unpredictability. A drumbeat signals departure, a small gift marks negotiation, a subtle rearrangement of a camp indicates that movement is imminent. These are practical behaviors, but to outsiders, they appear deliberate and mystical. A second gentle joke drifts in as you imagine a Viking muttering, "They waved a stick and I panicked," which isn't far from saga hyperbole. Trade interactions continue to reinforce a sense of caution. Vikings must observe carefully, speak sparingly, and offer goods that match expectations, or risk an awkward refusal. Mainstream evidence confirms that such exchanges were common and carefully regulated, reflecting both mutual dependence and subtle negotiation. Quirky sources claim that Sámi could curse improperly offered items, but historians still argue whether these are narrative embellishments or reflections of a more serious warning system based on reputation and social norms. The land itself acts as a teacher. Forests block line of sight, rivers slow pursuit, and snow muffles sound. Environmental mastery, simple observation, patience, and timing, is indistinguishable from magic when you are unfamiliar with it. Every step you take here seems measured, every breath deliberate, reinforcing the idea that the Vikings' fear was as much about skill and perception as about any supernatural power. A third light joke drifts in. A Viking scratches his head and sighs. "I've been defeated by moss and frost today."
which encapsulates the subtle, cumulative intimidation effect perfectly. As you pause to watch the wind lift over the plains, you realize that Sámi power is quiet, practical, and pervasive. It is a steady force, built not from aggression, but from understanding, adaptation, and the quiet ability to remain unseen until absolutely necessary. Fear, in this context, is not a momentary emotion. It is a strategy, a constant awareness that shapes the decisions of those who dare enter these lands unprepared.
You feel the day drawing to a close, not with the blaze of a setting sun, but with the soft, persistent glow of northern light that lingers long after it has faded. The tundra stretches endlessly, a quiet reminder that time here moves differently. The Sámi understand this rhythm, moving in tune with the subtle cues of weather, animal migrations, and the changing seasons. Mainstream historical evidence confirms that this mastery of timing, movement, and observation was central to survival and shaped every aspect of Sámi life, from hunting to trade to ritual.
You walk slowly across the snow, feeling how each step compresses the frost and leaves a delicate imprint that will soon vanish. The Vikings who entered this world centuries ago carried expectations of conquest and control, only to encounter a reality that refused to be mastered. This quiet, persistent competence, practical, adaptive, and deeply informed, was more intimidating than any weapon. A light joke drifts in. I came to raid, but apparently the world has other plans. And you smile at the understated humor in historical frustration. Stories of Sámi magic grew from this combination of skill and perception. Tales of disappearing camps, predictive hunts, and spiritual foresight circulated through Viking longhouses and southward settlements, embroidered with each retelling. Quirky tidbits in the Sagas suggest Sámi shamans could send their spirits out to observe or influence events from afar. Historians still argue whether these accounts are exaggeration, misinterpretation, or based on genuine supernatural belief. Either way, the effect was cumulative. The Sámi became figures of awe and respect, terrifying not because of aggression, but because of unpredictability and mastery.
You pause by a frozen river, watching the ice shift imperceptibly, reflecting the soft northern light. Seasonal migrations, careful timing, and knowledge of the environment combine to create a subtle power. The Sámi didn't need to fight. The land, and their understanding of it, did much of the work for them. Vikings learned, slowly, that patience, caution, and respect were often the wisest responses. This form of quiet dominance is perhaps the most enduring legacy, the ability to survive and thrive without ever appearing threatening in conventional ways.
A second gentle joke surfaces as you imagine a Viking scribbling in his journal. Defeated by reindeer and snow, I'll send a report, which captions the understated absurdity of misjudging quiet competence. Trade, seasonal movement, and social knowledge all reinforce this effect. Vikings who visited did so with caution, offering goods, observing rules, and never fully understanding the depth of Sámi expertise. Mainstream scholarship confirms that such relationships were long-lasting, built on careful observation and respect for knowledge rather than force. Quirky saga accounts of curses or magical intimidation are likely narrative enhancements, but they reflect real dynamics. Skill, adaptation, and understanding can be as fearsome as any weapon.
Historians still argue whether Viking accounts exaggerated fear to justify avoidance, or whether genuine encounters left lasting psychological impressions. Standing here in the cold, quiet expanse, the distinction feels almost irrelevant. You understand that respect, fear, and strategy can combine seamlessly, producing effects far larger than any battle ever could. A third light joke drifts through your thoughts as you imagine a Viking sighing, "Next time, I'll bring a compass and a prayer," which seems historically plausible.
You slow your pace, allowing the landscape, the wind, and the fading light to settle your mind.
The tundra holds its secrets and its lessons: mobility, observation, patience, and quiet mastery. The Sámi achieved what many empires could not. They survived, unassailable, not because they sought conquest, but because they lived in harmony with the land and understood it more profoundly than any outsider could hope.
As the light softens further, your thoughts drift toward warmth, safety, and the gentle rhythm of breathing. The lessons of endurance, subtlety, and respect remain with you, fading slowly like footprints in the snow. You can feel the quiet presence of a people whose power was invisible but unyielding. And now, as the night deepens and your own eyelids grow heavy, you sink into a calm awareness that the world is vast, complex, and full of wonder, and that sometimes survival and quiet mastery are more terrifying than any battle. The cold settles gently around you, softened by the memory of warmth from small fires and the slow rhythm of distant footsteps. Your breath drifts in quiet clouds, each one a reminder that life continues, patient and unhurried. You realize that the fear the Vikings felt was never about sudden danger or dramatic battles. It was about consistency, mastery, and subtlety. It was about moving through a world that didn't bend to your will, a world that demanded observation, patience, and respect. You let the idea rest, like snow on a branch, heavy and still. The tundra teaches you this lesson now. Power is not always loud. Knowledge is more effective than steel. Patience protects better than force. Even as you imagine distant camps moving silently with the seasons, the landscape offers reassurance. There is safety in understanding, in attuning yourself to the world instead of trying to dominate it. Each moment, each breath, each careful step carries you further into a calm awareness that life continues, measured by its quiet rhythms rather than dramatic triumphs. You feel your muscles relax, your thoughts slowing, folding into the gentle hum of your own awareness. The wind whispers softly, carrying stories of endurance, subtlety, and quiet mastery. And as your eyelids grow heavier, the world shrinks to the warmth of your bed, the comfort of soft blankets, and the knowledge that even in vast, untamed lands, life finds a way to flow quietly, steadily, and beautifully. Sleep now, gently, as the lessons of the North sink softly into your mind. The world is vast, full of wonder, and endlessly patient. Let the quiet mastery of the Sámi guide you into calm, steady rest. End of script.